Hello and welcome back. Today we'll begin a discussion of issues related to the Civil War. In this lecture, we will focus on three main topics: the changing Southern economy, Southern agrarian society, and arguments over slavery. It is no surprise to say that slavery was a brutal and inhuman institution. The image we see on the screen is telling evidence of this. An earlier lecture and material from Chapter 2 of Zinn's book try to explain how slave institutions were established. But knowing that the institution was brutal does not explain how people could justify the system, or why it was so difficult to abolish. In our lecture today, we will try and address these issues, and in so doing, outline how slave institutions intensified after U.S. independence, and how slavery led the country to the most bloody war of our history. So let's now turn to our first topic. To begin our discussion, we'll return to the era around the American Revolution and recall that the new nation struggled to unify itself. In the lecture called Creating a Nation, we reviewed the political negotiations that led leaders to retain slavery in the Constitution. One reason is because Southern states would not ratify the Constitution without it. But a second reason is a belief that slavery was about to die all on its own. The map on the screen provides an overview of the South's economic regions in the first half of the 19th century. The gray area represents cotton, and we see that it dominated the southern region of the nation. But cotton was not produced in very large quantities before the United States became independent. The reason for this is that cleaning seeds from cotton was so time-consuming, few growers bothered with it. Instead, wool from sheep was a prime source of yarn for cloth. Tobacco and rice were the products produced in largest quantities. In the map, we see that Virginia and North Carolina were the centers of tobacco production. We also see that rice was grown in the coastal areas. This takes us back to the reason that the Founding Fathers believed that slavery was dying out. It did not appear that either tobacco or rice plantations would survive. From 1750 to the 1780s, profits in tobacco were at all-time lows. One reason for this is that England, Spain, and Portugal had established so many tobacco plantations from 1650 onward that by 1750 there was a worldwide glut on the market, which led to very low prices. A second reason is that a fungus had infected tobacco plants in many Virginia and North Carolina plantations. In turn, plantation owners were at the edge of bankruptcy. Rice plantations were in a different bind. To produce rice, fields needed to be flooded. Because of this, the only regions that could economically grow rice were along the coast. So while rice plantations were in good economic positions, they could not expand. Considering these issues, the Founding Fathers made a pragmatic bet. They allowed slavery to continue and guaranteed Southerners that no amendment could challenge it for at least 20 years. The belief was that it would be dead by then. This picture is a diagram for a medical device called the pacifier. It was invented by Benjamin Rush, a physician and delegate to the Constitutional Convention. I present this image to show two main things. First, it shows a belief among many that slavery was about to end, and the plans they were making to try to incorporate former slaves as free people. Secondly, it provides a picture of how society viewed black people. The pacifier was a medical device that was supposed to give former slaves enough self-control so that they could participate as full citizens. If we look at the device, we see that it is meant to hold a person down for long periods. But it is not meant as torture. Notice that it has a pillow for comfort. Looking under the pillow, we see a bucket. This gives an idea that the person will sit for long periods. But the bigger reason is the person was going to be given diuretics. They were going to be cleaned from the inside out. The main thing to understand is that slaves were seen as people without self-control. If they were going to join the nation, they needed to be fixed. The importance of knowing this is that many people who wanted to end slavery saw the black community as inferiors. This was a pervasive view throughout the nation. While people believed that slavery may be wrong, they also believed that black people were not good material for citizenship. The rise of the cotton industry changed all the calculations of Southerners and Northerners. It not only pulled Southern plantations from the brink of bankruptcy, it created pressure for westward expansion and opened the door for the first major manufacturing industry in the United States, textiles. It is particularly important to understand that Northern industrialists were dependent on Southern cotton. This helps explain why they often ignored a growing domestic and international movement to end slavery. Most of us are familiar with the device called the cotton engine, or cotton gin, as it was popularly known. We can see an early version in these illustrations. It is a simple device that Eli Whitney developed from a machine that had been used in India. Cotton balls are placed on one side, the handle is cranked, and the seeds are filtered out. This device would be improved as textile industries expanded. In this map, we see that textile industries spread quickly. They were both in the north and south, with the biggest in the north. What is not shown in this map is the effect of Southern cotton on the English economy. England was the biggest exporter of textiles in the world. In turn, they were the biggest buyer of U.S. cotton. The end result is that cotton was the most important export product for the U.S. Northern industries, English textile mills, and the U.S. government all became dependent on cotton production by slaves in the South. So if we were to ask the question, why was slavery so hard to abolish? At least part of the answer is economic. The North, South, England all became dependent on products using slave labor. So far, we have explained how the economic system became dependent on cotton. But in itself, this does not explain why the labor had to be slaves. Industrialists in the North quite often argued that slavery was an inefficient labor system. Slaves had to be maintained even when there was no work to be done in the fields. They argued that it was much better to simply pay wages and only when there was work to be done. What Northerners did not understand is that slavery was not just a labor system, but a central part of the Southern agrarian society. This misunderstanding is an important part of the friction leading to the Civil War. With this in mind, let's now turn to Southern society and explain how Southerners felt that the North sought to destroy the fabric of their society. From 1800 onward, the United States grew rapidly. The national population was about 3 million in 1790 and grew to about 31 million by 1850. One way to measure this is by looking at the size of cities. In this map, we see that by 1820, New York and Philadelphia already had populations over 100,000. But in this map, from 1860, we see that New York had grown to over 1 million people, and Philadelphia was going in the same direction. Beyond that, we see the appearance of major cities in the North and West. This contrasts with what was going on in the South. There was rapid population growth in the South, but it spread across the countryside on plantations. Populations in the South were not concentrating in cities. The importance of population growth is that voting in the House of Representatives is based on population size. In turn, we see increasing political power moving to the North and West. And as noted in a previous lecture on infrastructure, voting power is related to pork barrel projects. Federal taxes were increasingly funneled to areas with bigger populations. So while Southern plantations were the most important source of tax revenue for the government, most of the money was going to develop the economies of the North and West. Southerners were conscious of this and were increasingly angry about it. To get a sense of the growth of the South, let's take a quick look at the next slide. We can see the rapid expansion of plantations. These maps give us a picture of intensity of the plantation system. This illustration shows how slavery moved west, but it also corresponds with the pressure for Indian removal. The tribes of the South occupied extremely rich land. So while population was growing throughout the country, the nature of its growth was different depending on the region. As noted, this led to political power in the North. But a weak urban sector is a second reason that Southerners felt increasingly vulnerable to the North. An urban sector refers to services and resources found in cities. The cities of the North had centers of banking, shipping, and insurance. Southerners depended on these services. They placed their money in northern banks. They depended on northern shipping companies to move their products. And they paid northern insurance companies large sums of money to assure the value of their products. Because of this, Southerners felt that the North controlled their wealth and were in a position to manipulate the South economically and socially. In the previous slide, we looked at population growth and expanding cities. We also saw how population growth in the South expanded westward with new plantations. This map shows the distribution of white, free black, and slave populations. In broad terms, we see that the intensity of slavery was not the same throughout the South. Instead, the Deep South had high percentages of slaves, and the border states, those that were nearer to the North, generally had small numbers of slaves. In most of the Deep South, slaves made up nearly half of the total population, and in some cases, like Mississippi and South Carolina, they were the majority of the population. The importance of this is that fear of slave rebellion is closely related to the intensity of slave populations. The image on the screen is of the Nat Turner Rebellion. This occurred in 1831 and set off a series of new laws seeking to regulate slave movements. In the rebellion, 60 white people were killed. In putting down the rebellion, 200 slaves were killed, and 56 more were executed after subsequent trials. Beyond the number of deaths directly related to the insurrection, new laws were written that limited slave owners' rights to educate their slaves. Slaves traveling without a white person were also required to have written documents of where and when they were traveling. As the South intensified control of slaves, the abolition movement also intensified. We began this lecture with constitutional issues. It is important to know that the international abolition movement started at the same time as the American Revolution. As the American colonists challenged England's right to govern them, abolitionists in England began to challenge their government's support of slavery. Quaker groups in England began a step-by-step process of gathering evidence of the brutal nature of slavery and organized a public campaign to educate the public. As part of this effort, former slaves toured England and published their stories. In this illustration, we see one of the most famous of these, Oluda Akuyano. This is one of the most famous illustrations produced by this group. It shows how slaves were packed into transport ships. As a result of these efforts, in 1808, England abolished slavery in its colonies. This move on the part of England also lent fuel to the abolition movement in the United States. Early in the century, few people were moved by the cause. But as the South intensified its restriction of slaves due to fear of rebellion, more and more evidence was gathered by abolitionists in the North. The abolitionist pressure added to the South's growing fear of Northern economic and political power. As the century moved forward, the South felt increasingly under attack from all sides. The Missouri Compromise needs to be understood as part of the growing economic, social, and political conflict between the North and the South. The compromise took over 15 years to conclude. The goal was to establish rights in the Louisiana Territory that the U.S. acquired from France in 1808. The compromise defined which areas would allow slavery and which would not. It also sought to assure the South that the North would not overwhelm them politically. In the map, the areas in red show where slavery was legal. The areas in green show where slavery was illegal. The document is called the Missouri Compromise because it allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and then took a section of land that belonged to Massachusetts to enter as Maine, a free state. This maintained equal power in the Senate for the North and South. While the compromise seemed to settle territorial and political issues, the settlement would not last. When the U.S. gained land from Mexico, the arguments over slavery started anew. We will cover that in our last lecture on the Civil War and Reconstruction. But for now, let's move to Southern paternalism. The term paternalism comes from Latin pater, meaning father. When used in reference to an organization or state, it means that individuals' freedoms are limited by social norms that give authority to people in positions of social, economic, and political superiority. In the South, it meant that owners of plantations were seen as aristocrats who took the role of fathers of the community, meaning that their will needed to be obeyed. But aside from having authority, Southern aristocrats felt they had an obligation to defend the well-being of their society. The key thing to keep in mind is that everyone had a proper place in society. As long as people recognized their place, society would run smoothly. This was a sharply hierarchical society that is similar to caste systems in other countries. Caste societies do not promote social mobility, meaning that people are not encouraged to move up the economic or social ladder. Individuals need to know their proper place and act accordingly. Additionally, caste societies defend notions of cultural and racial purity. People should marry and have children with their own group. In anthropological terms, this is referred to as endogamy. The South saw paternalism as a social good. Their defense of slavery should be understood within this framework. While Northerners criticized slavery on economic and moral terms, Southerners defended it on cultural terms. Moreover, they refused to see themselves as immoral. Instead, they promoted images of slaves as part of a large and happy community. If harsh treatment of slaves was used, it was seen as the proper role of a father figure who may need to discipline unruly children for their well-being and that of everyone else. In cultural terms, Southerners defended their right to own slaves very much like people today defend their right to raise their children in the manner that they see fit. So let's close our lecture with some political slogans that became popular in the years leading up to the Civil War. Free labor, free soil, free men was the slogan of the North. It meant that the country could only grow if we defended individual freedoms. Free labor meant that every person had the right to use their labor for their own well-being. Free soil meant that lands claimed by the United States had to be kept free from unfair labor competition, meaning slavery. Equality among white men sought to defend the racial practices of the South. Everyone had to accept their place in society, and society could not function smoothly if racial divisions were not maintained. We will start our last lecture with these concepts, but for now, let's close this lecture.